and welcome to another episode of the Addiction Help Podcast, where we talk about the latest in sports news and entertainment as it pertains to addiction recovery, and mental health. As always, I am Dan Hauser, your host. That is Jessica Miller, editorial director of addictionhelp.com, and my co-host, Jess. How's it going this week?
Super good. I think I was telling you earlier, I'm going to be doing a lot of cool bug things this weekend, and I'm very excited. As you guys know, we record this on Fridays a lot. So by the time you hear it, the weekend will have happened and I will have collected said bugs. And yeah, I'm very excited.
See, to me, I try to stay away from bugs.
Most people
You're
do.
going to the bugs.
I am. Like, we're doing a thing tonight where we'll be walking through like a nature preserve after the sun has gone down, which, if you know anything about Florida, there's going to be lots of bugs, and we'll have special lights that will attract moths. And then the guides are going to help us identify the different species. I'm so excited. But like, based on your reaction and also my husband's reaction, like, why would you do this?
Listen, I live in Florida too. I'm just saying, like, for the most part, not just Floridians, but people in general tend to stay away from the bugs. They tend to turn off the lights so the bugs don't go near them. And you're like, bugs, come to me.
Yes. Yep.
Well, don't worry, folks. We're not going to be talking about bugs today. This is not the bug podcast. This is the Addiction Help podcast. So let's kind of get into the topic du jour today. Jess, you came to me the other day after we got done recording the previous episode and kind of floated this idea to me for today's topic, where up until now, a lot of our conversations have stemmed around addiction and addiction help and mental health, but for the person actually suffering. And so you brought to my attention, I should say, that, it's also important to, I don't want to say shout out, but to give attention, the proper amount of attention to those surrounding the person who's suffering, whether it be direct family members, friends, loved ones, anyone else who may be kind of in that person's orbit. So today's episode, we're going to kind of focus on those people, and we're going to talk about the loved ones of addicts. And it's important to note before we get started, so this is not just going to be for those who want to help their loved one, although, of course, if you do, fantastic, and we absolutely support that. But we know that, unfortunately, when it comes to addiction, there are some times where family members or loved ones or friends, for one reason or another, unfortunately, they have to remove themselves from the orbit of the addict. And so this podcast is also going to be for those as well, too, as kind of ways to make sure you're taking care of yourself as well after you've had to kind of make that separation. So Jess, since this was your topic, why don't you go ahead and get us started?
Sure. Well, first we're gonna actually lean into, how to help your loved one. So this is assuming that the person who is dealing with the addiction in your life hasn't burned bridges to where you are still wanting to help them. And like, we hear that sometimes. I've actually, talked to people about stuff like that. I've been in situations before where it's like, okay, what can I do to help? And that's a really important subject. So first of all, I think before you really do anything, it's really important to actually understand what addiction is. And we've covered this in other podcasts. So if you have listened to those, great, good job. And maybe you've, gone to the website and read more. But if you haven't, we're going to just give you guys a brief overview now of what addiction essentially is, because there is still, unfortunately, a lot of misunderstanding as far as like what is addiction. And to give you a summary, just a sort of a brief overview, addiction is, first of all, it is a disease. It is and I know, like, if you're immediately cringing or bristling at that, that's okay. I get it. It is absolutely something that is happening in your brain, that to be an addict, it means you just don't have a regular brain. A lot of us don't have regular brains. Dan and I don't have regular brains, right? We've talked about this on other podcasts.
My brain is all sorts of just not normal.
Right. A lot of us have that. And so people who are addicts have, and we're still, researching it. We're still trying to understand, like, what part of our DNA is related to this, et cetera. But we do know that someone who really struggles with addiction tends to have a different brain. And they are likely people who, let's use alcohol as an example. Someone who is truly addicted to alcohol oftentimes drinks more than they should. They struggle to mitigate or manage how much they're drinking. They might spend more money on drinking than they should. They're spending a lot of time thinking about drinking, acquiring alcohol. Really, the addiction becomes like it starts to overshadow everything else in that person's life. And that's kind of how you know that it's addiction. And again, people, and this is where it gets a little kind of muddy and confusing. So bear with me. You can become addicted to something without necessarily being an addict. So, what does that mean? So, someone like me, we've talked in previous podcasts about how in 2020 I was either drinking, drunk, hungover, or thinking about drinking pretty much every single day of 2020. And if you look at my behaviors and how I knew that alcohol was problematic and that I needed to stop and that it was harming me, but it's like I kind of couldn't control myself, that qualifies as a substance use disorder or addiction. Those are kind of the same thing. However, once I quit, I have found that I am able to moderate now that I'm sort of out of that habit, out of that mindset. I did that healing internally for kind of why I was drinking, whole other story. I am able to drink in moderation. Some people can do that. Some people cannot do that. And that I think is the difference between someone who deals with addiction and someone who is an addict. So, all of this to say, it it's kind of like a sliding scale. And so if your loved one is addicted to something, understand that it can look different for a lot of people. And that was really helpful for me to understand when I was looking at my drinking because while I kind of used a little bit of hyperbole, like I was either drinking drunk or thinking about drink, like I was still maintaining my job. I was still going to family functions. So you might look at that and think, well, is that really an addict? I wasn't like spiking my morning coffee, it was still a very bad habit that was still I was not in control of. But understand that addiction is has a very wide range. And that can make it a little complicated. Couple other
It
just
it
factoids. Go
it's
ahead, sorry.
important to sorry, really quick before you get
Yeah,
into those, it's important to remember too, and we've touched on this in previous episodes. We've actually done an entire episode just on this, but addiction isn't always just drugs or alcohol or a substance of abuse. It can
true.
be
Right.
it's behavioral too, and we've done an entire episode on various behavioral addictions. So it can be an activity that started off as something that you just really enjoyed doing that turned into almost an unhealthy obsession. So it's important to remember as we continue talking today that when we refer to addiction, even if we only use drugs or alcohol in specific examples, it's everything. There are
Yep.
behavioral addictions as well. There are almost I don't want to say mental health disorder addictions, but there are certain things that borderline on the two of those as well, so, such as eating disorders and whatnot. Those can also be
Right.
addictive as
There's
well
a
too.
lot of
So
overlap. Yeah.
yeah, of course. So I just wanted to get that out there too. That for because we'll probably end up using mostly alcohol and drug examples in our discussions, but I just wanted to remind everyone that it's not exclusively drugs or alcohol. There can be
Right.
behavioral
Gambling
addictions as well.
addiction,
Yeah,
sex
gambling.
addiction,
Yeah,
shopping addiction. And
going
really
to the
the
gym. You can be
yeah,
addicted to going to the gym, which everyone's like, well, it's so healthy for you to go to the gym all the time. Well, not if you're hurting yourself in the process. But anyway,
right.
back to what you were saying, Jess. I just wanted to make sure that we kind of
Thank
opened
you.
everyone's mind so they weren't just thinking about just because some people have loved ones whose addiction does not involve any sort of alcohol or drugs at all. It involves some a behavior. So anyway,
Yes. Gaming, that's another one. And
yes,
so,
that's
like, really,
cell
again,
phones, social media, smart,
yes,
the
the
internet.
key here is this behavior, whether it's like Dan said, like a behavioral hobby, like gambling, gaming, or consuming of something, is this negatively impacting the person and starting to control their lives? And that's really the key you want to look at. And it's not It's not necessarily like a check yes or no. And if it's this, then it's addiction. And if it's this, it's not addiction. But we're trying to give you guys a sense of here are the key things to look for. And you can also, if you need a refresher, if you want the whole list, the DSM-5 or the Diagnostic Statistic Manual of Mental Illness, I think is what it's called. It's published, and you guys can, just like what are the signs of addiction? And there's, I want to say, like 12 different things that, like, the more you check off, the more likely it is an addiction is present. And so that's really the key. At first and foremost is identifying, okay, is this an addiction, or is this even just like a problem? So, couple more things about addiction. So we understand that overall it's a disease, and we understand that it's not, especially for people who are addicts. It is not curable, but it is treatable and manageable. And so there are plenty of people out there who have said, like, yep, I'm sober. I have been, I have avoided this activity or behavior for 20 years and I'm living a fantastic life. And that is absolutely possible. It is manageable. It never goes away, but it's just like a lot of disease, like my mental health issues. Like, I am never going to be cured of depression and anxiety, but I can manage it with medication and other tools to where it no longer is controlling me in my life. Um, let's see. I'm looking, just checking to make sure I hit everything. Um,
So real quick, I kind of have a little antidote because I know for me personally, I think you can agree. I mean, it might be a little tougher for you to say it because you're one who writes a lot of it. But sometimes when reading detailed information about addiction in a scientific way, it can sometimes be, I don't say confusing, but like sometimes you're just like,
it's a
I just
lot.
want to hear, I just want to hear it in layman's terms. So really quick, just kind of in the most layman terms of way that I can put it without, with still properly explaining it. So whatever the thing is that is resulting in the addiction, whether it's drugs or alcohol or an activity, uh, in the beginning, how it basically ends up starting is that your brain identifies that it likes whatever that is. So whether it likes the alcohol, in the case of what Jess was explaining with her story, or it likes the drug, or it likes gambling, or going to the gym, or shopping, or being on the internet, your brain recognizes that it likes that thing, and it causes more dopamine to be released in the brain. Dopamine is the natural feel good chemical that we all possess. It's what happens with we're doing something that we like doing, or we wake up in the morning and we're in a good mood. It's because we have an extra little rush of dopamine in the brain, and it's not doesn't always have to be a reason behind it. It can just happen. But
Right. It's
so
part of your brain's
yeah,
natural chemistry. Dopamine is
exactly.
your
But
brain's like
so when your
good chemical.
dopamine levels are elevated and they remain elevated for an extended period of time, your brain is like, oh, this is awesome. This is what it feels like when I've got all this extra fun energy in it, and I want to have that more often. And then as your brain kind of realizes and understands and recognizes that whatever that thing is that's leading to that is something that it wants more of because it wants to continue to feel goodness. To we talk about technical terms here, that goodness, it wants it more and more. And that's when you get to that point where you start to experience cravings, and you may even start to get dependent on it. And then from there, it can gradually progress if it's not properly addressed or monitored into a full blown addiction, to the point where your brain no longer can function properly, or has convinced itself that it can no longer function properly without elevated dopamine levels. And it will
And it
basically
becomes obsessed.
become, and it'll become super angry, aka withdrawal symptoms, when it doesn't get those. And then that's why you feel really sick, or get intense cravings, or feel lethargic, or sleep, or whatever it may be. It's because your brain is essentially freaking out and going into panic mode, or saying, rejecting it, or saying, I don't like this because I don't have this. And then that basically leads to addiction, and then the withdrawals that you go through when you're not, giving it what it wants. So to use all the sort of
Yes.
technical terms like the sand turner and goodness,
It's
and
been a few episodes since we mentioned that.
but so to put in as layman terms as I could think of, that's kind of a brief progression, so to say, of how everything works up in the brain.
Perfect. Yeah. So, with all of that knowledge, that brings us to, okay, great. Now I have an understanding of what my loved one is dealing with. And I've identified, okay, I feel comfortable or confident that it sounds like an addiction. what do you do next? So there are a couple things you can do. One of them, it sounds a little cliche, but it is a phenomenal option, and that's staging an intervention. This is especially, and it's not necessarily the route that you want to take um, for everyone. It's going to depend, and you're going to have to kind of assess that for yourself. We have more resources on our website about how to stage an intervention, tools for, kind of determining if it's the right option for you. So, you can go read that if you guys want to, but we'll just cover it briefly for now. So, um,
I've actually
one
read
of
some of those too.
you have actually,
Let's
yeah,
talk
which
about how
ones
you've got those great pages, but there are a few of those that I
that Dan
wrote
has
early
written.
on. Yeah.
Yeah. So I feel like you probably know a lot about this too. Um,
Well, the one thing I'll say before we get started too is, and
yeah,
and we talk about stigmas and destigmatizing things. I think this is a great example too. So many people hear the word intervention and they think to what they've seen in TV and in movies and kind of entertainment's perception of an intervention. And while that absolutely is one form of intervention, and that is an intervention that can be done, interventions aren't uniform. They don't always have to look like that, where everyone's sitting around in a circle and the person walks in and they're like, "Oh my God, what's going on?" Or
right.
so that is absolutely one form, and we'll talk about how the rest of them work here in a minute. But once again, like everything else, that everything works different for everybody. So that's not the only type there is. That's not the only type you have to do. There's so many different ways to go about doing it. And so, yeah, it's just important to know. Because I know for me, for example, the first time I heard the word intervention, my immediate thought was, "Oh yeah, I've seen those portrayed in TVs and movies and stuff." And then you learn
Right.
over time that's only one very specific type of one. So anyway,
Right.
back
Um,
to back
And
to
that's more like your formal intervention. That
yes,
we'll start
yes,
talking about that one. So, if your loved one is, pretty severely addicted to, whatever the issue may be, it has already caused a lot of problems. It's impacted you and probably other friends, family members, etc. Um, you can stage a formal intervention, which is kind of the sit down, bring them into the room. We talked about it in the episode where we discussed John Mulaney and how they did a formal
yep,
intervention for him and it saved his life. And he's very
yep.
grateful that they did that for him. And there's a certain structure to it. And if you are considering doing that, it is not not required, but highly recommended to seek the input of a professional interventionist, the person that kind of runs things and helps keep everything on track because it's emotional for you. It sucks. You're not there because you are having a party. You're there because you're worried about this person because you're so concerned that they're damaging your relationship themselves. You're worried that they are, on limited time. So having a professional there to help guide the entire process is really a great idea. And that's for your more formal intervention.
And for those hearing professional interventionist, wow, try to say that 5 times fast. For those of you hearing the term professional interventionist and thinking on yourselves, I don't see those in the yellow. Well, I'm dating myself. I don't see those in the yellow pages. Pretty much anyone that is a certified licensed mental health professional would be able to help with interventions. So,
Yes.
yes, there are people out there that on their business card it literally says professional interventionist. But there are also plenty who are
Right.
able to help with that too, whether they're psychologists, psychiatrists, treatment professionals. So
Addiction
just so
counselors.
so just
Yeah.
so everyone
Yeah.
knows that you don't necessarily have to go look up in the proverbial yellow pages professional interventionist. There are people out there that can help with that aren't that's not their official title on their business card, so to say.
Right. It's basically it's like having a mediator or a neutral party to help kind of keep everyone safe because the ultimate goal of an intervention is that you will get through to the person who is addicted and they will opt to get help. We'll talk more about that in a minute, but for now, just a couple of key things to know about if you decide to stage an intervention. One of the most important things you can do is plan ahead of time, have a script, have people you see this in the movies a lot, but there's a reason because it's very, very helpful. Write letters, actually plan exactly what you're going to say. Um, there is no such thing as being over prepared, honestly. Like plan for any possible scenario. Like, okay, what are we going to do if they get up and leave? What are we going to do if, I start crying in the middle of my letter? Like, will someone take over for me? Like, there are so many things that you can consider. So over planning is not possible,
You
honestly.
may even want to do a dry run, like go so far as to do a dry run. There's, like
Yeah.
Jess said, there's literally no such thing as over preparing for one of these.
Yep. And that being said, because it is very emotional, you want to be also very calculating is not the right word, but very, very particular about who you choose to be there. So let's say I'm doing an intervention for Dan, and Dan's severe Magic the Gathering card gaming problem. So I might want to include his wife, but let's say, Dan has spent their entire life savings on Magic the Gathering cards. She might be too emotional to go into that intervention to be helpful. You might have someone who's absolutely been affected by the addict and their behavior, so of course, that's valid, that's fair, but you don't necessarily need to include every person that's been impacted, because ultimately, again, you want that person to opt to get help. You don't want it to turn into a screaming match. You don't want it to turn into a sobbing, how could you do this to me? Where the focus starts turning in on the people who have been hurt. Yes, it's important for them to be able to articulate things, but it's not the point of an intervention isn't like a come to Jesus conversation about let's make this person feel terrible about all the bad ways they've hurt us. It is, we are going to give you examples of how your addiction and your behavior from your addiction have impacted those you care about, so that you can hopefully see, aha, this is a problem. I need to get help. So be very selective on who you invite to participate in this intervention. I hope that makes sense.
No,
Envy, you want to
absolutely. It's
add?
Yeah. So you mentioned how the person kind of leading the intervention, it's important to kind of stay calm and try to stay as collected as possible. When choosing who you are going to have participate, those are important things to factor into as far as picking somebody. If you have somebody, whether it's a family member or a friend of the person you're staging intervention for, and I don't want to say necessarily they're a hothead, but they are somebody who can sometimes lose their cool quickly, that might not be a good person to include in participating in your intervention, because if things start to turn south and they can't keep themselves and keep their cool together, that could cause things to spiral in a way that would be very counterproductive and to when it comes to the ultimate goal and whether it's successful or not. So while yes,
Right.
it's important for yourself to stay calm, cool, and collected, it's important that the people you invite to participate um, also are calm, cool, and collected.
Yep. Yep. Because again, the entire goal of an intervention isn't to let's gather everyone together and tell Dan how he's hurt us and make him feel bad. Let's gather everyone together and get Dan to understand how he's impacted us so that he will get help. You don't want the person to feel so bad that they just leave feeling terrible. You want the person to get help.
Absolutely.
Um, One quick note, and we do talk about this more on the website, but sometimes an intervention doesn't work. They are very successful, but one of the things that you should plan for is, okay, if that person is not willing to participate, or at the end of it, they still hear everyone out and they still do not opt to go into treatment, what is the plan? Have a plan for that too, because unfortunately that is a reality that can happen. And so, you did your best, and uh, you might end up being in the category of folks we're going to talk about a little bit later in the podcast. That's kind of,
Also,
that can happen.
yeah, also, if during the course of the intervention, if during anyone's letters or speeches or time they spoke, if they provided any sort of, I guess you could say, ultimatum or consequence for something. So, for example, if they were to say, if after today you still don't choose to get help, I am going to no longer speak to you, or I am going to cut you off financially, or I am not going to continue to sit here and watch you do what you do anymore.
Right. I
And then they
can't
still don't,
participate.
yeah, and then
Right.
they still don't choose to get help. You have to stick to that. You have
Yes.
to go forward with it. So if you say to somebody, hey, if you don't go get help today, I'm cutting you off financially, you have to then actually do that. Because if you don't, then what you're basically telling the person is that there's no consequences for their actions. And
Right.
sometimes it takes that person physically seeing or actually experiencing the consequences in order for them to finally um, metaphorically hit rock bottom, or to just say, okay, yeah, maybe I really do need to get help, because now all of a sudden I'm losing it's hurting me financially. I'm losing all my family. I'm losing all my friends because they don't want to deal with me anymore. So, but if you say you're going to do that and you don't do it, then they're going to say, okay, well, I can just
Right.
keep doing this because nothing's going to happen as a result of this.
Right. Why would I stop?
Yeah. What's in it for me for stopping, so to say, is as bad as that may sound.
Um, so outside of an intervention, I would say, one of the other things that you can do is just provide information. And uh, obviously, this is going to be a little bit nuanced. You're not going to constantly just be like, "Hey, fun fact, did you know cigarettes kill you?" Like, no, who's going to quit when you have that obnoxious friend that's constantly telling you things? You know what I mean? Like, that's not how. Dan lost it. I broke Dan. um, but
Here's a
but
fun fact.
here's a fun fact: you're gonna die. Like, don't. Let's not do that. But
We joke
but
because we care, people. We joke because we
we
care.
do, and it's such a dark topic, honestly. As
Sometimes you have to try to make it
yeah,
light in
yeah.
order to make it so it's anyway.
So our brains can just accept
We're
the
also two very
reality.
special human beings, so bear with us. But if you've been listening for the first 14 episodes or however many it's been, you know that
You know
we're
this,
special people. So
fan
this is
turners
nothing
and
new to you.
everything. Um, so providing information looks like, just giving sometimes factoids, or when the person is currently high, that's not going to help. Like, if it's like trying to reason with a drunk person, you can't do that.
That's
Um,
super, super, super important. And John Mulaney spoke about that too. The fact that um, he wasn't high when he went to his intervention, because he made the joke that had he been, he would have been there, 4 hours early to help set up or whatever it was. So that is the key. You want to
right,
make sure that there may not be a scenario where they're 100% sober, but you want them to try to be as
right.
sober
As
and
as
clear minded
clear-headed,
as
yes.
possible. Yeah, yeah.
Also not in the middle of an argument. That's so tempting. Man, I have been there with loved ones, where you're fighting about something, and then it brings up a potential pain point, and you want to bring it up in the moment, but like that's not going to actually fix anything. So it's doing it later when emotions aren't high, when the person's not high. So make sure nothing is high. And then that's a great time to maybe provide some information, because let's be honest. In drug culture, you're surrounded by other drug users who, might share stories of, I've been doing cocaine for 5 years and I've never had a problem. And so you take that anecdote and you store that in your mind as like, okay, maybe it's not as bad as all that. Um, or I'm drinking all the time, and I've drank and mixed, alcohol and benzos before. I did, actually, as an accident. I'm very lucky. And I was fine. So, therefore it is not as dangerous as they say. And that's not true. Um, and so like talking to your loved one about it, and just giving information, or even giving them resources, or pamphlets or website information, because like, this is something that we talk about with Chris sometimes. Like, addicts are going to addict. And if somebody wants to get high, they want to get messed up or whatever, they're going to find a way to do it. But for a lot of people, they do have that little thing in the back of their head that is sometimes a little curious, sometimes a little worried, sometimes like, can I continue to justify this behavior? And if they're looking through information, they might see data that makes them question, like, okay, maybe this really isn't good for me. Like Elton John, we talked about last week. He knew the first time he did cocaine, it made him throw up, and he went back and did more, but he knew in the back of his mind, that's probably bad. And so being the voice of reason and providing that helpful information about, how these, especially drugs, really, how these substances can impact you in the short term and the long term, might be information that the person didn't know otherwise. Like meth, for example. Did you know that using meth for a prolonged period of time can cause psychosis? And that psychosis, even after you quit, psychosis is basically like you're very oh gosh, I don't want to say like you've lost your mind, but in some ways it kind of is like that
You
where
kind of have.
you
Yeah.
you struggle with what is real and what isn't. You might also have hallucinations. You know, you can see like sometimes interviews with addicts and they're talking, but they're not really saying words that make sense. That's kind of like a psychosis. So you can do meth
Or
for,
they've also basically convinced themselves of,
Mhm.
not in a traditional hallucinogenic way, like, oh, I see something that's out there. They've actually convinced their minds that whether somebody's out to get them that
They're
may
being
not be or may not even
followed.
exist, or
Yeah.
they're being followed, or they have essentially convinced themselves that things are happening in the world that aren't actually happening, if that makes
Yes.
sense.
It's a lot of, like, connecting points that aren't actually there. They'll hear songs on the radio and think like, "Oh, that's the government, you know, like, sending me a message that they're watching me," and, like, that sounds silly, but it's sad because people who are dealing with psychosis really believe these things, and that's scary, and so the thing with meth is you can experience psychosis for up to a year after you have quit meth. You could have no meth in your system for an entire year and still experience psychosis. And like that's an example of something that people might not actually know. And so they're using these drugs thinking like, okay, you know, what's the worst that could happen? I just won't take too much and it won't kill me. But they don't understand that there are all these other potential consequences, side effects, permanent
Well,
impacts to their
and
to their bodies and
not just
brains,
mentally, but they can have some very dire
physical.
physical
Yes.
side effects too that can lead to significant and severe physical issues. And so I know we talk a lot about overdosing and the drug itself potentially being the reason why someone might die. But for that, that's one that's one specific example of how a drug can directly, or alcohol can directly cause you to die. For that one thing of overdose, there's 10 physical ailments that could be unknown side effects of those substances, could also cause you to die if you're not
Yep.
careful, or they're not, or not being treated.
Some heavy drinkers do damage their livers so bad that even though they have quit drinking entirely, they still die from liver failure. And like, again, that's one of those things that I don't think people necessarily realize. And I'm not saying all this to scare you. And I'm not saying this to tell you guys to try to use scare tactics to get your loved one to stop, because that, let's be honest, that's not going to work. If it worked, like we wouldn't have issues out there. But sometimes you don't know what you don't know. And sometimes providing information in a neutral setting can be very helpful to your loved one. So that is another thing that you could do if you're thinking of, what can I do to actually help? Because at the end of the day, and we talked about this with Leah, at the end of the day, like no one's going to get help unless they decide for themselves to do it. They're just not. And that, but like with me, if,
We've talked about that on pretty much every episode. I mean, we talked
yeah.
about it. Chris and I talked about it. You and I have talked about it on all these
Yep.
different examples. John Mulaney talked about it specifically with himself and his intervention. And you can't force somebody to get help. Um, they have to want to help themselves first and foremost. You can help them see the light, so to say, or help convince them to go get
Sure.
help, but they have to be ultimately the ones to make that final decision to do it.
And that's hard and that sucks. And I think this is a good segue into that next section because, like, sometimes you can try everything and that person is still going to do what they want to do at the end of the day, whether that's get help or continue using or doing whatever they're doing that's, causing problems for them. And so you might get to a point where you decide this is hurting me. This person, maybe it's as extreme as they've stolen from you, they've lied to you, they've lashed out at you, maybe physically harmed you in a state of, uh, inebriation, essentially. And so you might have a very strained or non-relationship with them. I know people, for example, that um have have family members that have struggled with addiction and they'll get clean and then, they allow that person back into their lives and then they relapse again. And it comes to a point where, and this is different for everyone, but it comes to a point where they decide, I can't continue to focus on them. And this has broken me. This has hurt me in different ways. And maybe it's financial, maybe it's physical, maybe it's in a lot of cases, it's going to be mental and emotional. So, like, how do you help yourself? Because at a certain point, you might decide, like, I'm done. I'm not going to keep trying to help this person who doesn't want to help themselves. So like, now what? And so we want to make sure that we are not just speaking to people who have loved ones who are addicts, that want to help. We also recognize that like, it's really hard and it sucks when you have this person you care about that's hurting themselves. So, like, what do you do for yourself? How do you cope with that? How do you process that? At what point do you decide, like, I'm done? And that's kind of, that's going to be an individual thing. Um, so so we have a couple of things that we've pulled for you guys specifically. And to start with, there are support groups that are specifically designed for people like us who may have loved ones that we've decided, like, I can't keep helping them. Or maybe you don't know. Maybe you are still helping them, but the reality is they're hurting you and it sucks. So groups like Al-Anon is run by the same folks who did Alcoholics Anonymous, but instead of being for the addict, it's for the person who is dealing with the addict and other people. Like, as someone who, without like revealing anything about people I care about, but I have people in my life that have struggled with addiction and it's hard and it sucks, but then talking to other people who knew what I was going through, man, that was so validating and helpful and empowering. And, they had like things that I hadn't thought of before. And like, well, look at it this way. Like maybe do this instead of, like in that moment. Try disengaging, or like I mentioned maybe a few minutes ago, don't try to have a conversation, a productive conversation about their behavior while they're high. Like, that sounds obvious, but you don't necessarily think about that. So you learn tips and tools like that in support groups. There's Al-Anon is for adult, Alateen, same group of folks, but that's specifically for teens, because the reality is, what does it suck? Sometimes kids are dealing with this with their parents and they need resources to be able to go to and safe places to go to talk about this. Um, these are the groups through the 12-step type programs, but there are also programs like Smart Recovery. I want to say it's like Smart Recovery for Family and Friends. It's pretty self-explanatory. And there are also just like local support groups and stuff too. So if you Google it and search in your area, or maybe look at like Facebook groups and things, you can find all kinds of just support group resources specific to what it is that you're dealing with, that your loved one is, struggling with. Sometimes you can also go to, let's say you go to an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting and maybe talk to someone there, after the meeting, not during the actual meeting. They will have resources where they can send you to. So, like, say you have a loved one that's a shopping addict, you might join a shopping addict and say, "Hey, I'm not a shopping addict. I am the loved one of one. Like, what resources? Where can you point me? And like, where can I go?" And they can help you. Um, Anything you want to add before I go to the next bonus point?
No, but I'll help with that transition. When we were putting the rundown together, you put something, and I'm uh, super excited to hear you touch on this next point. It was
Yeah.
about hold healthy boundaries. And
Yeah.
so I think that that is an incredibly important thing to keep in mind. We briefly touched on it during the intervention portion, where we talked about how if you're going to give any sort of ultimatum or consequence for actions, to make sure you hold yourself and everyone else to that. So on that note, go ahead and share with us a little bit about holding healthy boundaries, because I think it's an
Heck
incredibly
yeah.
important topic.
Well, it's actually pretty topically relevant because, at the time of recording right now, if you guys are on the internet at all, the whole Jonah Hill thing is blowing up. Now, I'm not going to, try to poop on him and his relationship and his situation, but it has brought an important conversation to the forefront of things, and that is boundaries. And it seems that there is kind of a misunderstanding a little bit of what boundaries are. So let me just briefly explain. A boundary is not a special magical rule that you can set that is specific to a situation that is non-negotiable and everyone has to listen to. So for instance, let's say I don't want my husband to eat the cookies that I just baked. And I tell him, I just made these cookies, don't eat these. And then I come into the kitchen later and he has eaten some of my cookies. I can't say, well, you just crossed my boundary by eating those cookies. Like that is situational and that is a specific incident. So that's not a boundary. Also not a boundary is uh I can't go to my husband and say, I don't want you, because he's really into like sim racing. It's basically like simulated uh race car stuff. Um, Super cool, super interesting. So I can't go to him and be like, you know what? I have a boundary that I don't like that you play this and I don't want you doing this anymore. So that's my boundary. That's not a boundary either. So what a boundary is, and I'm gonna give you guys some examples based on current context. You might say, okay, I am no longer going to give you money because I am concerned that you are using it on drugs. And so my boundary is I am no longer going to give you money. If you ask, then I will say no. And that's an important piece of boundaries is there's usually an if then. If you do this action, then the result is this. Um and so when it comes to loved ones who are dealing with addiction, knowing what your boundaries are is essentially knowing what are the uncrossable line that you have that you are just simply not going to allow. Boundaries are not something where you are trying to control the other person's behavior. And that's where a lot of people get confused with boundaries is they think by saying, husband, I don't want you eating these cookies. Oh, you've eaten these cookies. You've crossed my boundary. It's not really how it works. It I have this personal rule for myself. And if someone crosses that line that I've drawn in the sand that I've made clear to them, usually, I have a specific action that I am going to take. And boundaries are a really loving way of letting people know, hey man, this is the line. And if you cross it, this is what's going to happen. So um one example might be if the person gets into some type of trouble, whether it's legal, they get arrested, or, they get fined, they've gotten themselves a DUI, now they don't have a vehicle. Your boundary might be, I will not bail you out. If you get into trouble, I I am not going to be your resource to make your life easier for you. So if these things happen, then I am not involving myself. And like Dan mentioned earlier, it is so important that if you set these boundaries for yourself and you lovingly let this person know in your life, hey, this is the line. If they cross that line, you have to stick to it. So don't make a rule that you're then going to cave on. One
Yeah,
example is like,
you
if
have
you're
to,
going to do,
have to, have to,
have
have to.
to.
We can't stress that one enough. You
Yeah.
have to uphold your end of the bargain. Like
So if you
you
can't
tell
do
them
it,
that
then don't say it.
because once again, if you don't follow through on your end of things, then they are going to see that there are no consequences for their actions, and there will be zero reason for them to stop doing what they're doing.
Exactly. One common thing I think you see a lot, especially with like parents, but sometimes roommates too, is drawing that line of no substances in the house, period. And, you kind of run into a problem where you'll see sometimes people talk about, well, I'd rather her do drugs here in the house because then if she ODs, I'll know and I could administer Narcan and I'd rather her do it here than out in the streets. Like, ooh, that's a whole other conversation, honestly, about enabling and like not doing it. But let's say you decide as a parent or a roommate or whatever, no substances in the house. What is the if then statement for that boundary? If you do substances in this house, if I find them in this house, you're out. And again, like we said, you've got to stick to it. But boundaries not only help your loved one because, it makes them confront reality, it makes them deal with consequences, but they keep you safe. You don't want that stuff in your house. You don't want the stress of that. And that's just one example. You might have different boundaries of what you're comfortable with and not comfortable with. I'm not here to tell you how to live your life and tell you what you are and aren't comfortable with. That's up to you. But maintaining boundaries is so important. So you might need to spend some time and figure out, what are my boundaries? Like, what are my uncrossable lines with this loved one that I am going to hold, not only hold them to, but hold for myself to keep myself and my sanity protected. Um, so again, like, boundaries, they are really being talked about a lot right now. And I think it's very important to understand what they mean and then how to hold them for ourselves, because essentially they're very loving. They are not mean, they are not hateful. They are a loving way of saying, "Hey, friend, like, hey, Dan, here's a boundary. If you yell at me, I'm going to disengage." And like, that's not mean to Dan. I'm not doing something mean to Dan. I'm telling him, if this happens, this is what you can expect to have happen as a result. That's very kind if you think about it. So there's no guesswork, there's no like shock, like, "What do you mean now you're not talking to me just because I'm yelling?" So it's getting things out on the table. And when you're dealing with a loved one who is dealing with addiction, having boundaries for yourself is not only loving towards them, it's very protective towards you. And that's very, very important, because again, it sucks. You don't want to see your loved one suffering. You don't want to worry about them. You don't want to be in this situation. It sucks. So taking care of yourself is so important. Anything you want to add before I go to the next tip that we have?
No, I think let's
Sick.
take us home, so to say.
The last couple of things, as that are sort of recommended, is go to therapy. Like, therapy is fantastic. I think everyone on the planet should go to therapy at least once. It's so beneficial. But really, a therapist, you might be wondering, like, "Jessica, why would I go to therapy? I'm not the one with the addiction." Yeah, but you're the one dealing with the fallout of another person's addiction. And that can bring up a lot of feelings. Even just learning how to recognize, identify, and hold your boundaries, that's a great thing that you can do in therapy. So, having a therapist to help you through this and to give you resources and to help you work through maybe some of the resentment that you feel, the feelings of like, you're really torn. You're like, "I don't want to kick them out because I'm so scared they're going to die, but I don't want to enable them. Like, what do I do?" A therapist can help you with a lot of that. And finally, at the end of the day, remember that ultimately the responsibility is on them. It's not on you. It's not your fault, and it's not your responsibility to get them clean. And man,
that
that's
that
a
is something
hard
else
one.
that needs to be hammered home too. Like,
That's hard.
at
That's
the end of the
tough.
day, and it's really tough, and that's what makes this entire process so difficult, is the fact that you just want so badly for them to get help, and sometimes they won't get help, and
Yeah.
that can be incredibly draining, both physically, mentally, emotionally. It can also cause mental anguish on your end of things, and it's really, really important that, yeah, okay, they might not get the help that they need, but the last thing you need, or the worst thing for you, is for their actions to result in you starting to struggle as well. Because
Yeah.
especially if you're maybe like the only one that can truly help them, you can't help themselves. You can't continue to try to help them. So
Yeah. You can't
if
pour from
you're
an
not
empty cup.
okay, you can't help them to become okay, if that makes sense.
True. So yeah, make sure, at the end of the day, you got to take care of yourself. I know this sucks. Like, this is, Mama Jess is coming out like, "Baby, I know this sucks." Okay. But please make sure that you're getting enough sleep. Make sure you're eating. If you need to disengage, practice self-care, give yourself a spa day, like, and certainly, self-care even, incorporates, it's not just like spa day, just like buying a bunch of stuff, because like treat yourself day or whatever. It's as simple as make sure you're getting enough sleep, make sure you're eating, you know, um,
Not
doing
just
things
eating, but
like
eating
journaling,
properly and
eating right,
healthy.
eating
Yeah.
healthy meals, right? Like, take care of yourself. Okay. This is hard. This sucks. So be good to yourself. You're going through a lot, and it's okay to not be okay, like we say every single episode. Um, so on that note, I think, Dan, do you want to take us home?
Yeah. So, and that's a perfect segue again. We say it
We're
every
very
week.
good at that. What can I say? We're
We
like
say it every
professionals.
week. If we say it every week, if you or a loved one is struggling, and that's what we're hammering home today. Like, if you're struggling as well too, like it's important to get help. It's important to know that help is available. It's important to know that there are people out there that want to help you, whether you're struggling with mental health, addiction, anything involved in it. There is somebody out there somewhere that wants to help you, and if you are not sure where to look or you're struggling to find that certain someone, findtreatment.gov is a great place to find treatment options in your area. There's also the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration toll-free helpline, and that is 1-800-662-4357. Once again, 1-800-662-4357. And that toll-free number is manned by a person who will pick up a phone on the other line. It's not AI. It's not an automatic messaging thing. It is a human being on the other end of that line who will speak to you, who will help you out, whether you just need somebody to talk to or you need help finding uh, additional help or treatment options in your area. Somebody will talk you through that. And of course, as we talked about in the beginning, in the middle, and the end every week, addictionhelp.com, all of Jess's great work she does over there. Um, and specifically for this episode as well, Jess, you found a great additional website resource if you wanted to kind of share with everyone real quick
Yeah.
and let them know what they offer as well.
So we talk every week about the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. If you go to that website, samhsa.com /find, or no, it's findtreatment.gov is what the actual site is now that I'm saying it out loud. That's the same folks that do the hotline that Dan already shared. And that's for finding treatment centers and things. However, those same folks have a resource website for families, and it's samhsa.com /families. We'll put this in the description too as a link so you guys can click on it directly. But it's specific to resources for families as they are dealing with a loved one in the family who is struggling with addiction. And it gives important data, it gives important sources, it gives facts and guides and things for like therapy for the whole family and a lot of different angles basically dealing with addiction within the family because addiction just doesn't just impact the person who is addicted, right? It's like a ripple effect, not just them. And you're probably here because it's not just them. You know that it's not just them. So uh, that is an excellent resource for you if you need it.
And on that note, that will do it for us for this week's episode. As always, please continue to like, subscribe, rate, review, share with everyone, especially if you have a loved one who you think might be able to benefit from this episode in particular. Please share it with them. Please spread the word, so to say. So, and also, really, really quick, one last note before we get out the door, or before we leave, get out the door for the week. We talk a lot on the show, on every episode, about how it's okay to not to be okay. We also talked a lot about in previous episodes involving celebrities and their platform that they have to kind of share their own struggles and to let people know that they're not alone. So on that note, I just wanted to give kind of a quick shout out to Rob McElhaney. You may know him as the one of the creators and stars of It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia. You may also know him as the co-founder of the Wrexham soccer team over in the UK with Ryan Reynolds that co-own that team together. I know a lot of people loved watching that Wrexham show. Jess is like, oh, I don't know sports
Like,
things.
wow,
Sorry,
that's
you've
really
lost
cool.
me.
News to me.
But so this past week, he announced that at the age of 46, he's been diagnosed with various neurodevelopmental disorders and learning disabilities. So, it's not very common that diagnosis comes in at that age of 46, even and said it himself. And he also said that, and this is the reason why I bring it up, normally he's not one to share that particular type of information, but he said that he wanted to share it with everyone because he wanted others out there to know that they're not alone if they may be struggling, that if something doesn't feel right to them or they just feel that they're off, it's not because they're dumb or stupid, as he said, or something's
Right.
wrong
You're
with them.
not
They're just,
broken.
Yeah, you're not broken, and that he
You're
wanted
just
people to
one
know
of
that
us.
it's okay not to be okay, and you're not alone, and there are other people out there that can sympathize with you and want to help you. So I know we preach that every week. We talk about that every week. So they're just once again, sometimes people love hearing it from celebrities and people that they recognize their names of. So Rob McElhaney, thank you so much for taking that time to share that very personal, private information with people, and hopefully it'll help others out as well. So on that on that note, though, that will do it for us this week. Thank you all so much for listening, and we will talk to you guys next week. Have a great week, everybody.